designed to address Part 2 of Module 4A. This video will cover public land, urbanization practices, mining, and fishing. Let's begin by looking at an overview of public land. Public land can typically be broken up into 6 different categories based on their use and their management practices. Rangelands, as you remember, are typically federally owned, but can be leased by private individuals for their own use for animal husbandry. That leasing is managed by the Taylor Grazing Act. Next, you have wilderness areas, which are those that have been left alone and not touched or developed by human beings. This is the practice of pure preservation and is often associated with those ideas of John Muir. The wilderness areas practice restricted use, meaning that individuals have a very difficult time making their way there, and it cannot be used for commercial practices. And it is managed by multiple organizations within the federal government, including the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and the National Park Service. National parks are typically historical or geographic areas that are set aside for recreation. They have moderate restriction, which means that individuals can typically go there very easily, but there are some restrictions on the commercial and individual practices that can be managed there. The National Park Service is the one who manages our national parks. Next, we have national forests, which sometimes may be part of a national park or part of a wilderness area. Most national forests have multiple use, meaning it can be used for individual recreation, public use, as well as commercial practices such as logging. Then you have wetlands, which have what is called moderate to complete restriction, meaning most often that individuals who don't work there aren't allowed there. It is typically managed by the Endangered Species Act, which has specific conditions about the maintenance of habitats and is under the purview of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Lastly, you have the Wildlife Refuge and Sanctuary. This is complete restricted use. If you don't work there, you can't go there. It has the sole purpose of protecting an endangered species and maintaining its habitat, which means it is managed under the Endangered Species Act, and it is also under the purview of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This graph demonstrates for you the areas in the U.S. that are under federal management. The different colors are associated with the different programs, such as the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Land Management, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. One of the things that you should notice is the majority of this federally owned land is concentrated in the West, particularly through Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, and Montana. And the vast majority of this western land is managed by the Bureau of Land Management. More than 95% of the federal land in the United States comes under the purview of just 4 different organizations. First, you have the Bureau of Land Management, also known as the BLM. They are responsible for managing land that is used for grazing, mining, timber harvesting, and recreation. Most often, they are associated with wilderness areas and rangelands. The U.S. Forest Service is responsible for timber harvesting, grazing, and recreation. They are specifically designed to manage our national forests. However, they may have some play in managing wilderness areas as well. The National Park Service manages recreation and conservation on our national parks and some of our wilderness areas. And the Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for conservation, hunting, and recreation of areas where endangered species are found. They typically work with wetlands, refuges, and sanctuaries, and in areas of wilderness where endangered species habitat exists. Pieces of public land in the United States are forests. Forests are land that are dominated by trees and other woody vegetation, which can sometimes be used for commercial logging. It's often also used for humans in order to access resources such as fuel and materials for building our homes. One of the things to think about is old growth forests. These are forests that are at least 200 years old and have not been touched or developed by human beings. Unfortunately, the majority of old growth forest in the world has been lost due to commercial logging and the clearing of land for agriculture. In the United States, approximately 73% of the forests that are used for commercial timber are privately owned. And this is because they have been bought from the federal government or they have been designed as tree farms. There are multiple timber harvesting practices, but they typically fall into two categories: clear cutting and selective cutting. The big difference is whether we're removing everything or whether we're being very particular about the trees that we remove. Let's take a look at the different types of selective processes. Here are the examples of timber harvesting practices. At the top of this diagram, you will see an example of clear cutting. What happens in clear cutting is we remove the entire stand of trees. Sometimes the stumps are left behind, but the big thing is that the tree itself is removed. It can be replanted and allow for regrowth. The problem with this is you end up getting what's called even age stands, and often they're the same genetic variety of tree, which can cause problems when you have diseases or pests come through that attack a specific species or genetic strain. Clear cutting is the most common, it's the most economically viable, but it's also the most damaging for the ecosystem. You can have a slightly more sustainable version of this, which is called area strip cutting. When you have area strip cutting, you remove portions of the trees in rows. So you would remove an entire stand in one row, replant it or allow for regrowth, and then move to the next area. Instead of removing the entire stand at one time, you remove it in sections. It's not great, but it is slightly better than the full removal of an entire stand at one time. It does introduce the problem of even-aged trees in a particular strip, but it allows for more variety in age as you move through. Selective processes are very particular about the kind and type of tree that is removed. There are two basic kinds of selective cutting. The first one is shelter wood cutting. In shelter wood cutting, we go through and we remove the largest trees because these trees typically block sunlight from lower trees and vegetation. By removing these larger trees, we get large amounts of timber because these trees are typically larger, but we also allow for sunlight to reach the lower stories of the forest and allow those trees to grow to replace what was taken. You also have seed tree cutting. In seed tree cutting, you remove numbers of trees, but you're very particular about leaving the ones that are reproducing, such as those that are producing fruit or pine cones, for example. One of the concepts associated with forestry is fire management. The U.S. Forest Service, the National Forest Service, and the Forest Fire Department are responsible for maintaining our ecosystems within our forests and preventing as many forest fires as possible. First, let's talk about the types of forest fires, and then let's talk about the problems with fire suppression. In many ecosystems, especially forests such as temperate forests, grasslands, and savannas, naturally occurring cyclical fires are a good thing. They help to remove dead and dying organisms and leaf litter. They can produce heat that will allow certain seeds to germinate, and they allow for additional nutrients to be added to the soil as the ash from the fire breaks down. However, there are very different types of fires that can cause damage to the ecosystem. Let's talk about the three major types of forest fires. The first is a surface fire. This is the kind of fire that we could encourage because it reduces leaf litter and debris on the surface. The more this leaf litter and debris is removed, the less likely you're going to have a more damaging fire in the future. The second is a ground fire, and ground fires are less common in the U.S. than in other places. In a ground fire, embers of a forest fire sink underneath the surface of the soil and are able to maintain their heat and continue to burn. These are more often associated with forests that have high concentrations of peat in their soil. Therefore, in the U.S., it's not really that big of a problem that we have to deal with. The last kind of fire is a crown fire. These are the ones that are particularly damaging, both to the forest and to human interests. A crown fire engulfs the entire tree. It burns all the way to the top. These are the ones that can get out of control very quickly and can threaten human life and human property. If you remember the California wildfires from the last 2 years, these are all crown fires. Whether they were deliberately set, accidentally set, or were the product of natural occurrences, these fires were extremely deadly and extremely dangerous. Humans have designed multiple methods of fire management in order to reduce the chances that our lives and property will be threatened by these fires. One of them is fire suppression. This is the process of going out and trying to prohibit any kind of fire from happening at all. This may require the physical removal of underbrush and leaf litter. It may be part of the process that we all know, which is the Smokey the Bear campaign. Fire suppression, in general, has the idea that if the fire doesn't happen, humans aren't damaged, which is true. But the problem is, the longer you suppress a fire, particularly under specific conditions, the more likely you are to have a damaging crown fire. This is what happened in California. The Forest Service is beginning to move more toward this process of prescribed burns. What a prescribed burn is it's a practice of fire management that sets deliberate fires in certain areas under certain conditions that help to move away and burn away the underbrush and the leaf litter, thus reducing the amount of fuel that a fire could have if it were to break out. These prescribed burns can be managed by digging ditches, and they're always done under specific circumstances and with water available nearby in order to put the fire out should it go out of control. So we've talked about the different kinds of public land in terms of these things that are run by the federal government. Let's start talking about patterns of land use in urbanization. Here are some important vocabulary and concepts that you need to know as we move through the discussion of urbanization. The first is urban sprawl. Urban sprawl is the development of urban areas into the peripheral suburban or unused areas around the city. This is often a positive feedback loop. As urban sprawl continues, it continues to spread further and further out, making the urban area larger and reducing the amount of free and open land we have available. Urbanization is the process of moving people from rural areas to urban areas. Urban blight is the loss of tax structure that helps to support inner city areas, often leading to rises in crime and degradation of the literal inner city. An urban heat island is where the characteristics of an urban city, such as lots of dark surfaces, lack of vegetation, and lots of windows and metal, lead to heat being stored and spread out in the urban area, where the urban area is often hotter than surrounding land. The National Interstate Highway System was something that was developed in the 1950s that was designed originally for military transport by Dwight Eisenhower. Smart growth are practices of urbanization that allow us to be more sustainable and to reduce the amount of land and resources we use in our urbanization practices. This can come from multi-use zoning and from greenbelts, which are physical areas that limit the growth of a city using vegetation. Talk quickly about global urbanization trends. More than half of the global population lives in a city or an urban area. When we talk about urbanization and we talk about those rates, we can talk about how far they're growing. So what is the rate of natural increase plus their rate of immigration? Immigration relies on concepts called push and pull factors, things that will make an individual leave one area and go to another. Here are some of the common push and pull factors. The push factors tend to be those things that make individuals want to leave an area. These are very specifically poverty and war. Pull factors are those that make an individual want to come to a place. This can be jobs, educational opportunities, and entertainment. Some characteristics can be either push or pull, depending on their impact. These can be land availability, food availability, education, healthcare, jobs, or government policies. When you're asked about push and pull factors, there will be very clear descriptions to help you figure out which it is. Population dynamics, as we learned in Module 3, is the way in which human populations change and grow. What are the global trends for population dynamics? The percent of the global population in urban areas is increasing dramatically. That means the urban areas are expanding fast and using much more land area. And there's larger urban development in urban growth in developed countries than in developing countries. The cities are getting bigger in the developed countries. Additionally, poverty is becoming an increasingly urban problem, and it's often associated with urban blight. This graph shows you changes in land use from 1910 to 2010 in looking at rural and urban populations. As you notice, in the early 1900s, urban areas were much smaller in terms of their population. Around 1930 and continuing into the 1940s and 50s, the number of people in urban areas began to grow, and that skyrocketed up through the late 1900s into the 2000s, where we have populations of 250 million people in urban areas. Our rural population, however, has stayed relatively low and relatively the same. This brings out the idea that there has been a dramatic shift in where our people live. The majority of people who are coming into the country or who are being born in the country are going to live or work in an urban area, meaning we are using larger portions of our land for urban areas and urban residential areas. There are four major types of cities. You can have a general urban area. You can also have a megacity. A megacity has more than 10 million people in it. A hypercity has more than 20 million people in it. And a megalopolis is an area where two megacities are connected by a transportation corridor. Megalopolises tend to grow up along large-scale interstates and inter-country transportation routes. Megalopolises have large impacts on the way that land is used and the way that our fossil fuels are used because of transportation. One of the major examples in the United States is what's called BOWASH, which is the corridor along Interstate 95 between Washington, D.C. and Boston, Massachusetts. It's about 800 kilometers of urban areas, and it has over 35 million people within that area. You also have the Tokushima, Japan area, which considers Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, and Kobe, with 50 million people. In South America, you have the Brazil Industrial Triangle, which is the Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Belo Horizonte. In Europe, you have the connection between Amsterdam and Paris. All of these are considered megacities, and then together they are considered a megalopolis. You see some examples of the United States and areas that you would consider a megalopolis. You'll see the bright red on the northeast coast is the I-95 corridor. That is BOWASH. You will also see part of that along Interstate 80 in the south between North Carolina moving all the way through into Georgia and Mississippi. There is also a megalopolis along the Gulf Coast and the Texas Triangle. Here you see some examples of megalopolises in Europe. You'll notice there's one between France and Spain along the Iberian coast. There's also one that goes from northern Italy up through France, Switzerland, Germany, up into the UK, and from areas near Italy all the way up toward the north of Eastern Europe. So what are the urbanization trends in the United States? The first one is that we're consistently moving from rural to urban areas, where 3/4 of the people in the United States live in an urban area. But of those people, 1/2 of them actually live in a suburb, because people are moving out of what's considered the inner city or the city proper and moving into suburbs or smaller satellite cities. When we talk about movement, people used to move north and east. Now people are consistently moving south and west. And since 1990, many people have left the suburbs and are moving back into expansive rural areas. In urban areas, infrastructure is required for the city to function. An infrastructure is defined as the materials or items needed to support urban or rural life. These can include bridges, streets, roads, housing, water pipes, dams, schools, and hospitals. These are your typical physical infrastructure components. You can also have technological infrastructure, which includes your power, telephone, or cable lines. One of the major problems is across the United States, large amounts of our infrastructure are old and outdated, specifically when we're talking about our power transmission. It's important for us to have the funds to be able to update these things. The problem is, some of those funds are trapped in the hands of private individuals who don't want to let it go. Other reasons are because the city itself doesn't have the tax base or the tax value to be able to replace these infrastructure pieces and update them as needed. So we've talked about why people are moving to different places and how infrastructure is important for maintaining those urban areas. Let's also talk about urban sprawl. Remember that urban sprawl is the movement of individuals from the city itself into surrounding areas. This is largely caused because cheap land is available. And after World War II, the federal government began providing loan guarantees to single-family homes for returning World War II vets, meaning that those homes had to be built and were often built on the outskirts of cities. Once transportation in individual cars became a common thing, gas and federally funded highway systems developed, which allowed for movement between the suburb and the city where most work was done. Federal tax laws began encouraging home ownership by providing refunds or tax breaks for owning a home. Zoning laws, which are laws that regulate where particular things can be built and how particular plots of land can be used in an urban area, tend to favor large residential lots. And many of the urban areas have multiple political jurisdictions, which makes it a little more complicated to manage who moves where and where the residential areas tend to be. Four major concepts that have impacted this urban sprawl, and it's enhanced by federal and local laws and policies. The Highway Trust Fund is a U.S. federal fund that allows for construction and maintenance of interstates. This is tied strongly to the interstate highway system, which was designed by Eisenhower after World War II for military transportation. We also produced induced demand. Once we started using cars, by producing more cars, people wanted a car, and therefore we began desiring them more. Induced demand is when an increase in supply of a good causes increased demand. Zoning, which was a planning tool that was used to separate industries and businesses from residential neighborhoods. In recent years, zoning laws have been shifting more toward multi-use, where we can have high-density residential and light industrial areas in the same place. This can often lead to what's called a walkable city, which tends to be more sustainable and more environmentally conscious than traditional cities. What are the pros of urbanization? Urban areas are centers of economic development, education, technology, and jobs. They provide a large amount of opportunities for individuals. We also have studies that show that urban dwellers live longer and have lower infant mortality rates, largely because they have access to better education and better health care. There are environmental advantages of urbanization. You have access to recycling, and you can have high-density housing that reduces the land use for residential areas. And you have transportation, which allows cities to grow up and not out. You have mass transportation, like subways, railways, and buses. Every good thing, there's always a bad thing. So what are the bad things about urbanization? They have a large ecological footprint. They have massive amounts of carbon and greenhouse emissions, and they often cause what is called an urban heat island. This can be tied to the lack of vegetation, because heat is now transferred and collected in the urban area because of a lack of vegetation, large amounts of dark surfaces, and large amounts of reflective surfaces. The city itself is actually, on average, hotter than the area around it. Urban areas can also have water problems. This can cause waterborne diseases if it's not treated properly and sewage is not managed in the appropriate way. This can lead to just general water pollution and also disease transport such as cholera. Also, urban areas concentrate pollution and the health effects of them. Urban areas are notorious for noise pollution and light pollution, and they also cause microclimates, which are associated with urban heat islands. So, how can we continue to meet the needs of individuals who need urban areas and places to live, but still maintain our sustainability and plan for the future? Land use planning allows us to determine the best present and future use of land, and to look at zoning laws and the ways in which tax bases can be managed to produce the revenue to maintain our urban areas. Large amounts of tax revenue typically come from land taxes or property taxes in urban areas. It's important to maintain the zoning so that areas that need large amounts of infrastructure maintenance have large tax bases. Zoning laws typically identify something in one of four categories: residential, industrial, recreational, and commercial. Land use planning, particularly in the idea of smart growth, wants to mix residential and commercial together to allow for lower land use and more walkable and available cities. Remember earlier during our discussion of public land, there are two major things that you should think about. Public land has two different kinds: single use and multiple use. For single use public land, it's often restricted or moderately restricted. Private land can be broken up in those same ways, but private land, instead of using the term multiple use, uses what's called mixed use. Keep in mind, multiple uses for public land. Mixed use is associated with private land and the mixing of zoning for residential and commercial viability. Smart growth is a major way to develop our urban areas in such a way that it reduces our ecological impact and allows for more individuals to have the access and benefits of urban living. In smart growth, land use planning and zoning work together to encourage environmentally sustainable methods of development using mixed use, using green belts, and using walkable cities. It specifically reduces the dependence on cars. If an individual doesn't need a car, they're more likely to walk to places that they need to get, and smart growth requires that the use of mass transport be efficient and as useful to an individual as having their own car. A great example of a city that's built around smart growth is Portland, Oregon. Of smart growth have led to this concept called new urbanism. This is the development of urban areas based on the old village method that was used in Europe. It's a mixed-use neighborhood. It relies on cluster development, which preserves as much natural land as possible and reduces the private lots of individuals. It encourages walkability in cities, where everything that you would need is within walking distance of your home. It includes mixed use and diversity in our buildings and designs, quality urban design, environmental sustainability, which may include the use of renewable resources and large areas of vegetation, such as green roofs. It requires smart transportation. New urbanism is focused on eco-cities, which are cities that are designed for people, not cars. Urban development models are the ways in which we look at how a city has grown up. There are four major urbanization models or land use practices for urbanization. They are the concentric circle, the multiple nuclei, the sector city, and the vertical city. Examples of concentric circles often include New York City. Multiple nuclei is Los Angeles. The sector city is the early development of Chicago, and vertical are Tokyo or Shanghai. Asian cities tend to fall under this vertical category. A closer look at those urbanization models. The concentric zone model, also known as the Burgess model, demonstrates that the central business district of the city is at the very center, and other things have grown up outside of it. The concentric zone model looks like a bullseye, looks like a target, where the bullseye is the central business district, or the CBD. You don't have to worry too much about what the individual colors around the central business district mean, but this is what you do need to know. The central business district is in the very center, and the further away from the CBD you go, the more affluent you are. So rich individuals are going to live further away from the central business district than those that aren't as rich. The sector model is similar in that it has a central business district smack in the middle, but it actually grows up in varying shapes, often in what we would call pie wedges. And those pie wedges are defined by transportation corridors. So concentric circle model grows outward from the central business district in circles. The sector city model grows outward from the central business district along transportation corridors, often leading to these kind of odd shapes and these pie wedges. The multiple nuclei model is one that doesn't necessarily have a single central business district. It may have multiple CBDs that are designed specifically for particular areas. One of the best examples of the multiple nuclei model is the Greater Los Angeles area. Within the Greater Los Angeles area, you have Hollywood, Bel Air, Beverly Hills, Compton. You have all of these different areas that are part of the larger urban city, but may have their own small central business districts, often designed for one specific thing. The last type is a vertical city, which is exactly as it sounds. Rather than growing out, the city has grown up. It makes massive use of mixed use by putting residential and industrial commercial areas very close together. Problems associated with urbanization is what is called the urban blight and gentrification model. Generally, as a city is developing, the more affluent people move away from the central business district and manufacturing areas, especially when there is transportation corridors such as highways or things like subways. This causes individuals to take their tax money with them. This leads to urban blight when the inner city no longer has the tax structure and the tax money to maintain itself. Sometimes, after long periods of time where that inner city has devolved into whatever it is, you get this process of gentrification, where poor, under-maintained areas are taken over and refurbished by the middle class. In this case, the poor, often people of color, are displaced, and the prices of these individual areas increase, meaning property value goes up, and individuals who are poor can't afford to live there anymore. Of urban blight and gentrification tends to happen on a cyclical model. You have the initial development where property values are high. During the decline and stagnation phase, those property values drop, largely because the tax base leaves and the area falls into disrepair. Then you have the revitalization and gentrification process, where those property values begin to go up as the middle class moves in. Unfortunately, after the middle class is done with the gentrification process, the decline-stagnation cycle begins again. Shift gears and talk about mining. We've talked about public land, we've talked about urbanization. Now let's talk about how we get access to resources on that land. There are two major categories of mining: surface and subsurface. Surface mining is exactly what you think. It takes place on the surface, and there are four different types. You have open pit, area strip, contour strip, and mountaintop removal. In subsurface, you have room and pillar, lung wall, and in situ, which is also called placer mining. Subsurface mining is exactly what you think. You have to dig a channel and move down into the earth in order to get access to a resource. Presentation of different mining methods. Very quickly, let's look at the surface mining methods. Let's start at the bottom. You have an area mine or an area strip mine. This is where you remove soil, sod, and dirt from the surface of the earth in large areas. If you are working on a mountain or an area that isn't flat, you can use what's called contour mining. The contour mining does area mining on rows on the mountain. You strip a piece of the mountain, and then you move up, and then you strip a piece of the mountain, and then you move up. And you continue doing that in stepwise fashion until you go as high as you would like to go. The problem with area mining and contour mining, you tend to get what is called a high wall. This is when the refuse or the tailings of the mining are thrown over the side and piled up. There is major damage and danger in these things actually falling loose or collapsing on individuals who are working in the mine. You also have mountaintop mining or mountaintop removal. This is where you use explosives to literally remove the top of the mountain in order to get to resources. It's important to note that surface mining is dangerous. There's a lot of heavy machinery that could malfunction, and it's possible for you to damage yourself through a fall or contact with a high wall. This graph does not show open pit mining, but it's very similar to the contour mining in that you move downward into the earth in concentric spirals. Let's talk subsurface mining. Subsurface mining requires you to dig into the earth and produce channels or shafts. Some of the examples of these are the room and pillar, where when you're doing the shaft mine, you leave certain stands of rock to help support the surface. The long wall does something very similar in that you move along a steady, stable wall in order to remove the resources. Subsurface mining is dangerous on its own. There's always a chance of collapse or contamination with various different poisonous gases or compounds. Subsurface mining is also a problem when you have what's called acid drainage, when rainwater leaches into the abandoned mine and moves minerals such as mercury, lead, cobalt, and cadmium into the soil and then into groundwater. We have in situ mining, which uses chemicals to leach minerals like copper from a seam without digging them. Placer mining is very similar, except you're using mining of stream beds in order to pick up alluvial deposits. Placer mining is very similar to the idea of panning that you may see in old movies. The thing we have here with placer mining is that it's more mechanized than what you would see in the films. We've addressed acid drainage, which is when runoff and infiltration water carry toxic materials and heavy metals from the abandoned mines. These can get into the water and eventually get into drinking water and can contaminate humans. There are two laws that are important to think about when we talk about mining. The first is the General Mining Act, which allowed individuals to move into an area and claim an area as their own mine, and then be able to mine for the resources there. The Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, also called SMCRA, SMCRA, requires companies to reclaim the area after the mining is finished. This reclamation includes the planting of vegetation, the filling in of holes, and the maintenance of water quality nearby. Let's shift gears and talk about how we access fish as a resource. Remember earlier in Module 4A, we talked about commercial and industrial animal husbandry. We do the same with fish, although there are multiple different practices that allow us to use wild fish as well as unnaturally cultivated fish. When we talk about commercial fishing, there are four major problems associated with it. The first is depletion. Depletion occurs when the population of the fish is so low that you can't reproduce enough to be able to maintain your financial ability. It becomes more expensive to find the fish than it is to sell the fish. Industrial fishing is largely associated with genetic extinction, where we overharvest a particular population to the point that their genes are removed from the gene pool forever. The removal of fish from the ecosystem causes major domino effects and trophic cascades that can change the way in which predators and prey live in the ecosystem. And you have this idea of bycatch, which is when an unneeded or unwanted animal is caught within the fishing process. Often the bycatch are things such as seals, dolphins, sea turtles, and other items and organisms that tend to be tossed overboard, often dying in the process. Here are some examples of bycatch. You'll notice that you have these organisms that are caught in nets in this case. At the top left, you'll see a stingray that's caught within an area of crabs that were caught in the North Atlantic. Underneath that, you'll see a seal that is trapped in a dragnet. You'll also see in other images whales that are caught in dragnets, as well as a sea turtle. And you also have a shark in the top right that's been caught in this fishing compound that looks as if it's had its fins removed before it's tossed overboard. One of the things that's a problem is when specific organisms are found, even though they're not what you're fishing for, if they produce an economic boom, they're going to be used. The shark typically had its fin cut off for the production of shark fin soup. Let's look at the wasted value of popular fish that we obtain. If you look here, for example, the red snapper has $27.2 million in wasted value. Crabs have $4.6 million in wasted value. What this means is when these fish are caught, the waste value is calculated in terms of bycatch, as well as the amount of fish that is unable to be sold because of disease, deformation, or the buyer just doesn't need anymore. So how do we fish? There are four major types of industrial fishing: trawling, purseine, longlining, and drift nets. It's important to note that longlining is limited to an 80-mile net and often is associated with sea turtle bycatch. Drift nets are allowed to be 50 feet below the surface and 40 miles long in United States water. In international water, they can only be 1.6 miles long. Here are visual examples of the different types of fishing. Let's start first with trawling. Here you'll see in the very center trawling fishing. Trawling, also known as bottom trawling, takes a weighted net and drags it along the floor of the ocean, catching any fish that are in that area. Bottom trawling is the worst type of commercial fishing because it has a massive impact on the ecosystem of the ocean. The next one is drift net fishing. Drift net you'll see at the bottom right. The nets are anchored and are put together with bait to attract specific organisms. A drift net is designed to capture the fish by its gills. Unfortunately, drift nets are often associated with sea turtle bycatch. And by the time that the net is reeled in, the sea turtle is already often dead or near dying. Then you have longline, which you'll see at the bottom left of your screen. Longlining is when you have a long fishing net with hooks hanging off the bottom. Those hooks are baited for specific organisms, but also pick up sea turtles and other organisms who come in for the food. Lastly, you have probably the most sustainable method, which is called purseine method. You'll see that at the top right of this diagram. In the purseine method, you need a spotter plane and a couple of boats. The spotter plane flies around looking for a particular school of fish. It will radio to the boats, tell them where the fish is, and those boats will drag a net around that school of fish and then cinch the net closed. This allows for very specific targeting and less bycatch than any of the others. These are our natural methods of industrial fishing. We can also use artificial methods, or what's called aquaculture, to raise fish. We can do that through fish farming in cages near the coast, as you see in the top left. Or if you look in the bottom center, you may use deep sea aquaculture cages if those fish are particularly designed for deep sea areas. So what are some of the laws and treaties that are responsible or associated with fishing? The first is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, also known as CITES. This law makes it illegal to transport, trade, sell, or own an endangered species in signatory countries. The Global Treaty on Migratory Species makes it very particular that you have to maintain the migration patterns and pathways of particular organisms, most often birds. This also includes maintaining fisheries in particular areas because it is part of the migration practice and it provides food for the fish. The U.S. Marine Mammal Protection Act provides specific protections for ocean mammals and requires that individuals release mammals that are caught in bycatch whenever possible and avoid catching them on purpose. You have the U.S. Endangered Species Act, which is designed to protect the habitats of organisms that are considered endangered. The U.S. Whale Conservation and Protection Act is very similar to the U.S. Marine Mammal Protection Act, except that it specifically is targeted through various types of whales. Lastly, you have the International Convention on Biological Diversity. This is an international agreement that says it's important for us to maintain the genetic diversity of our organisms, so we make every attempt to make sure that genetic diversity is preserved. So how can we avoid overfishing and maintain our resources so that we can still feed on fish, which we've seen before would help to reduce the land use impact of industrial husbandry? One of the things we can do is go back to maximum sustainable yield curves and estimate population sizes accurately using that precautionary principle. Remember, the maximum sustainable yield says this is the theoretical number of organisms we can harvest and still maintain a population that can replenish itself. The precautionary principle requires us to use less than that and putting us at the optimum sustainable yield. By estimating population sizes and assuming that we have an estimate that is too large, we can make sure that we are using less than what we actually could, but enough to meet our needs. We could also reduce government subsidies for overfishing. The government pays companies to fish, and we use these ideas of quotas, which allow individuals to catch only a certain amount of fish. However, if one company is under their quota, they can trade their remaining values to another country or another company, which still allows for the same amount of fish to be caught. Additionally, we could think about aquaculture and artificial fish farming. The problem there is the same as the problems you may find in the CAFOs. Disease is rampant, and antibiotics are used in order to combat that. Also, you have very low genetic diversity, and some people who eat farmed fish say it doesn't taste as good as open water fish.